Ziggy Marley has finally peeled back the curtain on the towering legacy of his father, Bob Marley. And what lies underneath is far from the smooth, mythologized portrait the world has grown comfortable with. For decades, Bob Marley has stood as an unshakable symbol of peace, rebellion, and spiritual liberation, his dreadlocks and lyrics immortalized across generations. But what happens when the truth comes not from a biographer, not from an outsider, but from within the Marley family itself? What happens when Ziggy, the eldest son of the reggae legend, speaks not just as a musician or a public figure, but as a son who watched his father from within the walls of their home? His recent remarks crack through the idolized image of Bob Marley, revealing a man who was not only complex and flawed, but also difficult to understand and sometimes even harder to love. Ziggy's revelations paint a portrait not of a reggae prophet gliding through life with divine grace, but of a conflicted man, consumed by a vision of greatness, shackled by ego, and driven by demons that fame only fed instead of exorcised. To understand the magnitude of Ziggy's words, let's rewind this reel and revisit the rise of Bob Marley, not the legend, but the man. Before he became a global icon, Bob Marley was just a boy named Robert Nesta Marley, born on February 6, 1945, in the rural village of 9 Mile, St. Anne Parish, Jamaica. His father was a white Jamaican of English descent, and his mother was a young black Jamaican teen. That mix gave him a complex identity from the start. Life wasn't easy, his father wasn't around much, and money was tight. So, young Bob grew up surrounded by struggle, resilience, and the deep spiritual roots of Jamaican life. As a kid, he was quiet and observant, always absorbing the rhythm of the streets and the heartbeat of his people. It wasn't long before he found a natural connection to music, using it as a way to express what words couldn't say and what daily life made hard to explain. Bob eventually moved to Trenchtown, one of Kingston's most notorious neighborhoods, and that's where the story starts to pick up. Trenchtown was loud, vibrant, rough, and overflowing with raw talent. Bob linked up with a few like-minded young men, Peter Tosh and Bunny Wailer, and together they started a little group called the Wailers. They weren't instantly famous. At first, they were just hustling studio time, learning to navigate the underground recording scene, and working with producers like Coxsone Dodd at Studio One. In those early days, they blended American rhythm and blues with local Jamaican sounds, experimenting with harmonies and messages that resonated with the everyday person. Bob was writing lyrics that spoke to poverty, injustice, and spiritual awakening long before the world was ready to listen. Their first real taste of success came with the 1964 hit Simmer Down, which shot up the Jamaican charts and made the Wailers local celebrities. But it wasn't until the 70s that the international spotlight started to warm up. In 1972, the group caught the attention of Island Records founder Chris Blackwell, who saw something unique in Bob's voice and vision. Blackwell gave them a deal that was unheard of for a Jamaican band at the time: an advance, studio time, and international promotion. The Wailers released Catch a Fire in 1973, and it hit the global scene like a wave. The album was raw and defiant, mixing reggae beats with a rock influence that made it more palatable to Western audiences. That was the beginning of Bob's climb, but it was just the start of a much deeper journey. Not long after, Peter Tosh and Bunny Wailer parted ways with the band, but Bob didn't miss a beat. He kept the name going as Bob Marley and the Wailers and released Rastaman Vibration and Exodus, 2 albums that cemented his role not just as a singer, but as a voice of resistance and hope. Songs like No Woman No Cry, Jamming, and One Love were cultural statements soaked in faith, unity, and rebellion. Bob had found a way to take the personal and make it universal, to take the struggle of his people and turn it into anthems that could be sung anywhere in the world. His music was both a protest and a prayer, and that duality made him magnetic. Wherever he went, people felt the rawness in his words. By the late 70s, Bob was more than a musician, but had become a musical symbol. He survived an assassination attempt in 1976, performed at the Smile Jamaica concert 2 days later, and left for London shortly after. That period in exile gave birth to some of his most legendary works. Exodus was named Album of the Century by Time magazine, and it's easy to see why. Bob wasn't just making music anymore. He was shaping history with every lyric. He played sold-out shows around the world, moved crowds to tears, and brought together people from all walks of life. He even performed at the One Love Peace concert in 1978, where he famously joined the hands of Jamaica's political rivals, trying to heal a nation through the sheer force of presence and song. The momentum never stopped. In 1980, he toured the world with the Uprising album, giving it his all, even as his health quietly deteriorated from the cancer that would later take his life. That same year, he played in Zimbabwe during the country's independence celebrations, which was one of his proudest moments. No doubt, Bob became more than who people adored, but also worshipped as an icon. Even as his body weakened, Bob's spirit remained defiant. He poured everything he had left into the music, the message, and the mission. Those who saw him during the Uprising tour recall a man who looked increasingly frail, yet radiated an unshakable intensity on stage. It was as if he knew time was running out, and every performance became a sacred offering, a final communion with the people he sang for. Behind the scenes, the cancer had spread to his brain, lungs, and liver, but Bob refused to let it silence him. He kept moving, kept creating, and kept reaching across borders and barriers, determined to leave behind more than just songs. He wanted to leave behind a legacy that could never die. But behind all the glory and the global acclaim, Bob's personal life told a different story, one that was less glamorous than his music. Having grown up in Bob's strange dual world of half myth, half man, Ziggy witnessed the dissonance firsthand, and when he finally decided to speak about it, he didn't soften the blow. What Ziggy makes clear is that his father was a mystery. He was a man of few words and even fewer emotional expressions. He wasn't the affectionate, involved type, nor was he particularly patient. He was distant, wrapped in his world of music, mysticism, and messianic responsibility. Ziggy describes his father not as a nurturing parent, but as a towering figure who inspired fear and awe more than warmth and comfort. The Marley household wasn't one where bedtime stories were read or feelings were shared. Instead, it was a place governed by Bob's energy, which Ziggy says could fluctuate between electrifying and oppressive. The children, while proud of who their father was, often felt like spectators in his orbit, close enough to be burned by his intensity, but too far to touch his heart. This emotional distance wasn't just a matter of Bob being busy or distracted. For him, it was something deeper, something built into his worldview. Rastafarianism, which Bob embraced with unshakable conviction, became both a shield and a sword in his life. While it gave him spiritual grounding and fueled his lyrical fire, it also provided a rigid lens through which he interpreted the world, including his relationships. Ziggy has alluded to the way this belief system shaped Bob's idea of masculinity and fatherhood, often to the detriment of his family. To Bob, emotions were things to conquer, not express. Vulnerability was a form of weakness, and control was a virtue. These ideas didn't just exist in his lyrics, but structured his family dynamics as well, often leaving his children to grapple with a father who seemed more prophet than a parent. This spiritual rigidity created distance, especially for those closest to him. Bob's children were often left to interpret his love through scattered gestures and poetic riddles rather than through consistent presence or emotional openness. His way of showing care was indirect, a song here, a moment of quiet attention there, but rarely the kind of engaged parenting that fostered emotional safety. Ziggy, in particular, has spoken about the deep longing for connection, for clarity, for something more grounded than the mystical aura that surrounded their father. In many ways, Bob's towering spiritual presence cast a long shadow, one that both inspired and isolated those expected to grow beneath it. However, this emotional distance was only one of his troubles. There were others like the issue of infidelity, something Bob Marley was notorious for. Despite being married to Rita Marley, his longtime partner and the mother of several of his children, Bob had a string of extramarital affairs that resulted in numerous other children. By the time of his death in 1981, Bob had fathered at least 11 children with 7 different women. This web of relationships created a strange and often painful dynamic for the Marley children, many of whom grew up in a blur of overlapping households, shifting loyalties, and emotional competition. Ziggy doesn't shy away from acknowledging the damage this caused. For all the love Bob preached in his music, he often failed to provide it in a way that felt tangible or stable to his children. Rita Marley in particular deserves more attention in this story than she often gets. Rita Marley's entry into Bob Marley's life was not just a romantic twist in the story of reggae's rise. It was the beginning of a profound, spiritual, and often painful journey. Born Alfarita Constantia Anderson in Santiago de Cuba and raised in Kingston, Jamaica, Rita came from a deeply rooted Christian background. Music was part of her soul before she ever crossed paths with Bob. She had been singing with a girl group called the Solettes when fate brought Bob into her orbit. He was already beginning to find his voice with the Wailers, but it was a time of struggle and uncertainty. If you are enjoying this video, appreciate it by giving it a thumbs up. And if you have not subscribed, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button. Rita and Bob met in the early 1960s, both young and hungry, both shaped by the hardships of the Trenchtown streets, where survival bred resilience. Bob noticed Rita's voice first, and then her spirit, bold, defiant, and full of conviction. There was something raw and honest about her, something that matched the fire inside him. They married in February 1966, just before Bob left for Delaware in the United States to work and support his budding music career. It was a separation that would test them early on. But even as distance pulled them apart physically, it tethered them emotionally. In letters and brief visits, the bond between them began to deepen, not just as lovers, but as partners in something spiritual, something revolutionary. Rita had become a Rastafarian not long before, and her faith anchored her through the many tests to come. When Bob returned to Jamaica, he brought not just a clearer vision for his music, but a deepened commitment to the spiritual and political path that both he and Rita would walk. From then on, their lives became more than a marriage. They became a ministry. Rita didn't just stand beside Bob as a wife. She stood with him as a believer in the message he was crafting. She was there in the early days when they had nothing, when the Wailers were just another group hustling through Kingston's turbulent music scene. She was there when the music began to rise, when Catch a Fire and Burnin' began to open up the world stage. Rita sang as one-third of the I3s, the female vocal group that gave Bob Marley and the Wailers their unmistakable soulful harmony. Her voice was part of the sound that shaped reggae's global ascent, but she was rarely given the same attention as the men she stood behind. Still, her role went far beyond harmonies and studio sessions. She was often the person holding everything together when Bob's fame began to stretch the family thin. As the tours got longer, the stages got bigger, and the temptations more relentless, it was Rita who kept the home stable. She gave birth to and raised several of Bob's children, including some born from his relationships with other women. That reality, that ache, was one she learned to carry with grace, even when it wounded her. In interviews, Rita has spoken candidly about the sorrow she experienced seeing Bob fall into the arms of other women, sometimes only days after sharing a stage or studio. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was public, and yet, Rita rarely let bitterness take center stage. Instead, she poured herself into what they were building. The Marley name was no longer just Bob's. It had become a legacy that she was actively shaping, brick by brick, through quiet sacrifices and unwavering dedication. Rita was more than a wife. She was the compass when Bob got lost, the mirror when he needed grounding, and the shield when the outside world turned hostile. She protected not just his image, but his spirit, even when hers was under siege. It is not a stretch to say that, without Rita Marley, the Bob Marley we know might not have existed in the same way. She was often the one who pulled him back to his roots, reminded him of the mission behind the music, and refused to let the movement dissolve into mere entertainment. While Bob's image began to be immortalized across murals, posters, and album covers, Rita carried the invisible load: mother, manager, bandmate, spiritual partner, and survivor of a kind of love that was both divine and devastating. The emotional cost of their union reverberates through their children. And this is what Ziggy reflects on, often acknowledging his mother's strength, speaking of her not as the long-suffering wife, but as the matriarch of a powerful legacy. Her endurance was not quiet submission. It was an active, conscious choice to believe in something larger than herself. She believed in the healing power of music, in the spiritual force behind Rastafari, and the transformative potential of the Marley name, not as a brand, but as a mission. Even after Bob died in 1981, Rita remained the steward of that mission. She continued to perform, to build the Tough Gong label, and to preserve Bob's message. But she also finally began to step into her own light. Through her foundation work, her solo music, and her memoir, Rita carved space for herself, not just as the woman who loved Bob Marley, but as a force in her own right. Still, her story remains too often in the shadows of his. Her pain, her faith, and her fierce love deserve more than a footnote in the reggae legend's history. Rita carried a burden that was rarely acknowledged in the public narrative. Her strength, resilience, and unconditional love were constants, but they came at an enormous personal cost. In many ways, her story too has been shrouded in the shadows of Bob's fame and the weight of his genius. Yet, as Ziggy begins to unravel the complexities of his father's life, it becomes clear that Rita's role is fundamental in sustaining Bob's legacy and shaping the family that carried it forward. Ziggy Marley has never shied away from sharing his thoughts about his father, Bob Marley, even if those thoughts are far from the idealized, saintly image that has long been associated with the reggae legend. In recent years, particularly with the release of the 2024 film Bob Marley, One Love, Ziggy has opened up more than ever about the complexities of his father's legacy, acknowledging the contradictions and imperfections that made Bob both a revolutionary figure and a deeply flawed man. His reflections, while full of reverence for the genius of Bob Marley, are also marked by a raw honesty that paints a more complete, human picture of the icon. Of the truth, Bob Marley's impact on the world cannot be overstated. His music transcended boundaries, his messages of peace, unity, and resistance resonated with people across the globe, and his spiritual and political influence still lingers in the world today. Ziggy has always recognized this greatness. There is no denying the profound impact Bob had on shaping not only the sound of reggae, but also the cultural and political landscape of the 20th century. However, in recent interviews, Ziggy has made it a mission to reveal the more complicated truths about who Bob Marley was as a person. In a 2024 interview with the Los Angeles Times, Ziggy openly spoke about the contradictions that shaped Bob's life, acknowledging that his father was not just a figure of peace and love, but also someone with a deeply ingrained aggression. "People love my father, but he had violent tendencies. He was a fighter," Ziggy said, a remark that cut through the mythologized version of Bob Marley that many fans hold dear. Ziggy, however, doesn't want this side of his father's life to be erased from the narrative of Bob Marley's legacy. He understands that his father's music and message were revolutionary, but he also knows that Bob's journey was shaped by deep internal struggles that were not always easy to reconcile with the persona of peace and love that the world came to know. One might feel uneasy hearing this, as it doesn't fit. The legend isn't always what we want to hear. Yet, Ziggy believes that it's the truth we need. Ziggy's reflections are not about tearing down the legend of Bob Marley. They are about making space for the full, human version of him. For too long, the image of Bob has been sealed in a kind of cultural sainthood that resists scrutiny. This reverence, though well-meaning, can often overlook the emotional toll that came with being Bob Marley. In his reflections, Ziggy does not attempt to demonize his father. He doesn't seek to tear down the man who shaped not only his own life, but the lives of millions of people around the world. But he does seek to bring balance to the narrative. In Ziggy's view, acknowledging Bob Marley's flaws and contradictions does not diminish his greatness, but only adds depth and understanding to the man behind the music. Bob Marley was a genius, yes, but he was also a man who had struggles, contradictions, and flaws that deserved to be part of the conversation. So, in many ways, Ziggy's decision to speak out is not an act of rebellion, but of liberation. For so long, the Marley legacy has been shrouded in reverence, insulated by the kind of cultural sainthood that resists scrutiny. But Ziggy's reflections pierce through that insulation, making room for a more complete, more human version of Bob Marley, one that acknowledges the cost of greatness and the wounds it leaves behind. Now, here's where fans get to decide. Was Bob Marley really the man we knew him to be? Or was it all a smokescreen to hide all of his flawed complexities? Ziggy's story might just have changed the way you see the Marley legacy. Ziggy's approach is not one of bitterness or resentment, but of reckoning. He is not interested in painting Bob as a perfect man, nor is he interested in portraying him as a villain. Instead, Ziggy seeks to tell a more honest story that recognizes both the brilliance and the pain, the triumphs and the struggles. In doing so, Ziggy is not only reclaiming his father's legacy for himself, but also making room for a fuller understanding of who Bob Marley was as a person. Bob was a genius, yes, but he was also a man who left a wake of emotional wounds in his path, and those wounds are part of the story. The music industry, especially in the era of Bob Marley, wasn't built for nuance. It was built for myth-making, for creating legends out of people, often at the expense of their humanity. Bob became a brand, a symbol, a global ambassador of reggae and Rastafarianism. And in becoming that, he began to live in a way that served the legend more than the man. Ziggy's commentary suggests that while the world gained a prophet, the Marley children often lost a father. Bob's energy was directed outward to the stage, the studio, the movement. What was left of the home was often just fragments. The children grew up in the glow of his fame, but they also grew up in its shadows. By the way, there's something deeply poignant about the way Ziggy talks about his father now. He doesn't just reflect on Bob as an individual, but as a mirror through which he understands himself. As a musician, Ziggy inherited not just the Marley name, but the expectations, the pressures, the legacy. But unlike his father, he has tried to approach fame with a different philosophy. Ziggy's perspective is one rooted in emotional availability, personal introspection, and familial connection. In his own words, Ziggy has said that being a better father than Bob was to him has become one of his life's guiding missions. And in that, we see a cycle trying to break, a generational wound trying to heal. For the singer's first son, talking about his odd relationship with his father is his way of taking ownership of his family's narrative in a way that feels both healing and necessary. His decision to speak out, to confront the contradictions of his father's legacy, is not an act of rebellion, but of liberation. For years, the Marley family story has been told through a lens of reverence and idealization. And for years, that story has left little room for the complexities of real human relationships. But Ziggy's reflections pierce through that insulation, bringing to light a more complete, more honest version of the Marley family history. Ziggy's reflections also shed light on the emotional complexity of growing up in Bob Marley's shadow. Being Bob Marley's son was never as simple as basking in the glory of his fame. How many of us truly understand the toll of living under a microscope? I mean, it's easy to worship icons, but how much harder it is to be their children. It came with its own set of challenges and pressures, challenges that Ziggy has had to navigate throughout his life. Ziggy's decision to speak out, to share his truth, is not just about his father's flaws. It is about the toll that fame, greatness, and public scrutiny can have on those closest to the person at the center of it all. Ziggy is not asking anyone to forget Bob's greatness. He is simply asking for a more honest, human version of his father to be acknowledged. Bob Marley was a man who had an immense impact on the world, but he was also a man who had struggles, contradictions, and flaws that deserved to be part of the conversation. Ziggy's reflections allow for a more complete understanding of who Bob was and the cost of greatness. Ziggy Marley's decision to speak openly about his father is not an easy one, but is a necessary one. It is an act of love and liberation, a way to honor both the greatness of Bob Marley and the emotional complexities that come with being part of the Marley family. In the end, Ziggy's reflections remind us that even the greatest among us are human, and their legacies are not only shaped by their triumphs, but also by their struggles. But the question that lingers after hearing Ziggy's thoughts is not whether Bob Marley was a good man or a bad man. Rather, it is whether greatness must always come at a price. Can someone change the world and still be present at home? Can one be a revolutionary without becoming a stranger to your children? Bob Marley's life suggests that these things are harder to reconcile than we'd like to admit. The man who sang of redemption often could not provide it within his walls. And the children who bore his name were left not just with a legacy, but with the burden of understanding it. Rita Marley continues to carry the torch of the Marley name with grace and resolve. Her efforts in preserving Bob's legacy through the Bob Marley Museum, the Tough Gong label, and various philanthropic efforts are monumental. But even she has hinted at the pain behind the public story. In her memoirs and interviews, Rita has spoken about moments of betrayal, loneliness, and the emotional complexity of loving someone who belonged as much to the world as to her. Her strength is not just in what she endured, but in how she transformed that pain into purpose. She raised her children with values of love, humility, and unity, often compensating for the absences Bob left behind. Rita's story is not one of silent suffering, but of loud, dignified endurance, and is a narrative that deserves as much attention as Bob's own. With Ziggy stepping into this phase of honesty, the music world finds itself re-evaluating what it means to honor someone's legacy. Is it by protecting their image at all costs, or is it by telling the whole story, even the parts that sting? Ziggy seems to believe in the latter. His words are not arrows, but are keys to understanding Bob Marley, not just as a cultural figure, but as a deeply human, deeply flawed man, whose greatness was never meant to be understood in isolation from his imperfections. In revealing the distance, the hurt, and the complexity, Ziggy doesn't destroy the legend, but he enriches it. He reminds us that greatness isn't clean or simple, it's jagged, it cuts both ways, and sometimes, the very people who change the world leave the deepest scars on those closest to them. The story of Bob Marley, as told by Ziggy, is not one of deconstruction, but of completion. It is the story of a man who soared high and stumbled often, who preached unity but wrestled with division, who offered the world salvation but could not always offer his children stability. If you grew up idolizing Bob Marley, Ziggy's words may be difficult to hear, but they are necessary. They force us to reconcile the music with the man, the message with the medium, the myth with the truth. And in doing so, they give us a fuller picture not just of Bob, but of the family that survived him, the woman who stood beside him, and the son who dared to speak. So this revelation isn't about ending the Bob Marley legend. It is only the next chapter,